Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Jennifer Fidel, the Director of Public Programming for CC Institute. And this morning we're in our second of a four-part series on the art of fairy tale analysis with Muriel McMahon. A couple of things before we get started. Muriel did send us a reference list, and that went out to the community last week. If you didn't get that reference list of books and other things to look at, let Annette know at the office and she will send that on to you. And also Muriel's having a little issue with her internet this morning, so if she freezes up, we've got a plan. But just be patient. This will be recorded, so don't worry that you'll get a good clean recording at the end. So hopefully Muriel will stay connected with us the whole morning. And so if you also don't have any good sound on your end, it's probably, it's not this end, so just maybe adjust your computer. And like I said, you will get a recording, so don't worry. A couple of things I'd like to mention, two announcements. We've got some more Saturday programs for free, the complimentary lectures. And in 2 weeks, we've got Dr. Hank Brightman. He's a professor at the Navy War College. He's going to present his work on the archetype of the warrior in the U.S. military, and also the archetype of the protector and the over-identification with the police. So that is going to be really timely on what's going on in the world today. So I hope you join us, and that is in 2 weeks. We haven't sent that flyer out yet, but that's complimentary. We did this morning get out a flyer for our Ricardo Mondo presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Sylvia to introduce Ricardo's presentation for next Saturday. So thank you all, and enjoy. Sylvia?
Thank you. Grazie mille. It's my pleasure. Part of the liaison as Director of International Studies and working with Jennifer on this particular one, and Michael to introduce Ricardo Mondo. Absolutely wonderful, talented, brilliant Jungian analyst and a longtime friend and collaborator with Dr. Michael Conforti. He's going to be talking about the pandemic and the masked Prometheus. And so, you know, Michael participated in Italy a couple of weeks ago at a summit that Dr. Mondo had put together in Catania in Italy. So these are the connections that, you know, it seems like COVID is really making very clear all of the connections that we have internationally. So please, if you haven't received it, it is a complimentary lecture from 2 to 3:30. It will be translated by Massimo Nava, who is the son of Floda Nava, who many of you have heard speak, is the Italian teacher for Michael for many years, and a very, very esteemed colleague. So with that, Muriel?
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you all for coming back for lecture number 2 or seminar number 2 on our delightful journey into fairy tales. I was very thrilled with the engagement that I could see in these little Brady Bunch boxes last week when I was presenting. And I received no less than 25 emails from a number of you, asking questions, giving feedback, indicating that you were very engaged with this study. So I'm hoping that those questions that I was able to answer and those that I didn't answer, that I will answer in the course of the series. So, please keep doing that. Please keep engaged. It's great as a teacher to find out that the students are asking questions, and some of them that I didn't even think of. So that shows the caliber of the audience that we have. As Jennifer indicated, I have rural internet, and for whatever reason this morning, it's giving us a little bit of grief. So, well, giving me some grief. So you can imagine at about 11:15, when we had no rhyme or reason for understanding why the internet wasn't working, reminded me of when I did my APA presentation for the Assisi Institute. And just before I was about to begin and turn on my PowerPoint, my laptop computer died. And so I had people offering me their laptops and offering me, you know, sticks that we could record. So there is really a spirit in this community, a spirit of it takes a village. So here is our plan, that if I freeze, Sylvia has my script. And so because you dedicated your time to showing up live, we figured it wasn't fair to say to you, oh, well, you know, the internet went down and you'll get a recording later. So that Sylvia will follow my, so I'm going to stick a little bit more to the paper. So if my internet goes down, then she will be able to pick up. But I also can't promise that there won't be some asides as well. So here we go. So last week, I think we made a wonderful opening into the study of archetypal approaches to fairy tales. And we started with the wonderful tale, The 12 Huntsmen. And what I would like to review, because I think we've got some people on today who weren't on last week. So we translated the title last week, The 12 Huntsmen, and we took a fair bit of time. And that was some of the feedback, that someone made a wonderful comment about the idea that psyche will show up if given space and time. So the fact that we demonstrated that with our slow approach to the tale, I think speaks to, you know, to spirit and soul. So we suggested that some cycle in the masculine relationship to animal instinctual was coming to completion. Through the powerful number 12, we can infer that some novelty or some novel level of complexity is emerging. And then, because I was a former English teacher and English as a second language teacher, I sprinkled this with some grammar as well. So because the number 12 is an adjective describing the noun huntsman, complexity or novelty with respect to hunting and the human-animal reciprocity or lack thereof is suggested. And one of you Sue sent me a note saying that, does it also not imply that if there are 12 huntsmen in a kingdom, it's either so large that perhaps it's grown unruly, or that it's out of balance because 12 huntsmen, what is that going to do to the animal population? So I think that that was a very astute comment. So, but here's where I want to go today, that it also needs to be noted, we spent all that time on the title, The 12 Huntsmen. And I don't know whether you discovered it or not, but that was not the original title of the tale. The original title of the tale, and here I'm going to try my German, Der König mit dem Löwen. Now, that's probably so bad that anyone who speaks German can't interpret it, but the original title for this tale was The King with the Lion. And so I should probably say, when I was in Zurich, they offered language classes where you could learn, you know, Swiss German. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to take those classes. And every noon hour for 2 hours, I would go to this German lesson, Swiss German, which is a beast unto itself. And I would study with my colleagues. And at the end of the class, while they were moving ahead to stage 2, the teacher suggested that I repeat stage 1, because although I was learning the language of psyche in Swiss German just wasn't working for me. Although there was one weekend where my friend Isolde and I, we got in her car and we went into Germany and we drove through the Black Forest. And while we were driving through the Black Forest, she told me German fairy tales in German. And it was like in that forest with the telling, it felt like I was understanding it. So there's something about a foreign language that even if you can't pick it up in your sensibilities, that I think it speaks to some part of our soul. And I think fairy tales do that. They work that magic. Okay, so if we apply the discipline that we learned and we practiced in our last seminar, even to this alternate title, or we could say this original title, we have to conclude that the king of the human and the king of the beast have some relationship worthy of exploration. So the king is with the lion in that original title. The grammatical preposition with is placed alongside the two nouns, king with lion. As such, this infers a relationship, the preposition between the two nouns. It's curious that this original title was replaced, and it was replaced with the title we spent so long on last seminar, The 12 Huntsmen. This title shows the alignment of the teller and perhaps the audience to the fairy tale issue at hand. I was taught in Zurich that if my analysand brought a lengthy dream to analysis into the hour, ask them first to title the dream. And I think many people do that they title their dreams in their journals. So the chosen title might express an unconscious communication of the issue, or at the very least, offer up some indication of the orientation of the dreamer to the issue. So already we can say, remember we were saying last week that Marie-Louise von France believed that fairy tales showed us the anatomy of the psyche. Yet, as they are written down, as they are removed from the oral tradition, then we get what happened to myths. We get some contamination by cultural complexes, or some contamination by personal complexes. So maybe that's what happened when it went from the lion with the king or the king with the lion to the 12 huntsmen. That in the teller or in the audience, they were more interested in the huntsman than perhaps they were with the relationship between king and lion. So I just invite you to hold that out, to wonder, why would it change? So in the case of our fairy tale, the original title focuses the lens on the relationship between king and lion, and by association or resonance, it implies authority. Authority in the spiritual conscious and the instinctual realm. The alternate title focuses the lens on the 12 huntsmen and draws our attention to focus on human-animal relations as a form of long-term reciprocal exchange. And I'm going back to what I was talking about last week in terms of hunting, that in order for the hunt to continue for both the human and the animal, there has to be some understanding of reciprocity, and that there's no surplus, that you take what you need and you use what you take. So it's almost as if we have a title within a title, like those wonderful, I tried German, I ain't gonna try Russian, but those wonderful nesting dolls, you know, so we have a title within a title. As an analyst, when someone brings in a dream within a dream, it's kind of interesting because it's like, it's struggling so hard to come across the barrier between consciousness and the unconscious. So this dual titling reinforces perhaps my translation of the tale and the archetypal dimension that's being explored. So namely, the nature of reciprocity between instinct and archetype in the ruling executive function in the psyche. So we have an executive function in the psyche. In this tale, because of the title, we're going to be wondering about that in the king as well as in the lion. How is everything being filtered through that executive function, which would be authority? So what that means in simple terms, our instinctual or animal nature must be in a right relationship to our conscious and spiritual aspirations. If the authority of the ego lauds one side over the other, the imbalance disrupts the harmony in the psyche. The ancient Asclepians, our first dream analysts, they defined dis-ease, disease, as being out of step with the gods. So remember, our fairy tales are there to tell us how psyche works, to tell us how the processes unfold. So in today's seminar, as promised in that flyer that we sent out to you, I want to focus on another important element of the fairy tale called the dramatis personae, namely the persons that are in the tale. So let me tell it a little aside. When I was in Zurich, my training analyst, Dr. Ian Baker, was telling me that he did an experiment when he was studying, and his training analyst was C.A. Meyer, who had analyzed with Jung. So it feels like the lineage is that Ian would be my grandfather. So what, my Jungian grandfather. And so what Ian did in his experiment is that he had a tape recording by his bed. And when he woke up in the night with a dream, he would speak he would speak into the tape recorder. And then he did this, I don't know, I'm going to say he did this for 6 months. In the morning, he would get up with his journal and his pencil, and he would record the dreams, as most of us do, as they were remembered. He didn't listen to the recordings. And then what he had a friend do is to transcribe the recordings for him. So he had his written account and he had the oral account in the recordings. And he compared the two. And what he told me he found is that in the middle of the night recordings, there were fewer people named. It's as if the energy was expressing itself, but it hadn't attached a name to it. It hadn't attached a person to it. And so he said it really gave him an understanding about how the characters that inhabit our dreams are aspects of ourselves. But the ego gets caught up in saying, well, it's Sylvia or it's Jennifer, but it's the Sylvia-ness or the Jennifer-ness. And that's also what happens in fairy tales, that it's these people who will carry the drama, and they're seldom named, just like in Dr. Baker's experiment. So the characters are the forms that carry the drama. And I remind you, and I will probably remind you as often as I think to, that the characters in a fairy tale are not the same as characters in a dream, because they're not the personal unconscious that's being explored, they're the collective unconscious that's being explored. So a fairy tale is not a personal dream. It does not map onto the personal unconscious. If anything, it's a collective dream. A fairy tale tells a story about what is universal in the psyche. Marie-Louise von Franz believed that fairy tales, more than myths, were the blueprints of the essential processes in the psyche. She believed they were less contaminated with personal and cultural material. She believed they were more psychological than political or sociological. But I'd like to give a shout out to Jane, because Jane Knox sent me an email and she shared with me a blog that she had written. I hope this is okay, Jane. Not if it's okay, okay. And what she did so beautifully in this blog is she had a fairy tale and she broke up that fairy tale in the telling and inserted how she was struggling with the isolation and the COVID story. But what was so beautiful is she didn't appropriate the tale and change the tale to serve what she was trying to express. And I think that is so beautiful. I think Marie-Louise von Franz would have been clapping her hands, because there is something collective. It constellates something in us personally, and we have to be able to align ourselves and know the difference. So maybe on the chat, Jane, if you're willing, you could just put up your blog link. So if people wanted to check that out, they could, but I'll leave that to you, not to put you on the spot, but I thought it was a beautiful piece of work. Okay, since we all have personal and cultural complexes, and these complexes eclipse the voice of psyche, the fairy tales are more freed from these complexes. They're more objective than subjective. And you're going to hear me reinforcing that again and again, probably to the point that it will drive you crazy. So that loyalty to the objective psyche is the discipline that we practice at the Assisi Institute. Gifted to us by Dr. Yoram Kaufman and developed by Dr. Michael Conforti, we're talking about an orientational approach to the objective psyche, and it's infinitely more accurate and helpful than the subjective lens of our personal associations or experiences. So like a map or an X-ray, the fairy tale shows us without conjecture the territory of our inscape. Gregory Bateson, who was the partner of Margaret Mead, said once, "The map is not the territory. The map is not the territory." If a map shows me a mountain or a river on a landscape, what I think about the river or the mountain is inconsequential to the geography. The geography is not altered by my perceptions. And I'm going to really emphasize that in the third lecture. So if you don't completely understand it yet, just hang on to it. The objectivity of the map indicates what I might encounter, and I best be informed of such. At the end of the journey, I might give commentary about my experience of the mountain or the river, but my commentary will not alter the map. It will not alter the geography. The same is true of fairy tales. So that said, the characters in a fairy tale, be they animal or human or inanimate objects, they map out some of the terrain of our inscape instead of the landscape, the inscape, really how we work. I think that's why we love them so much. They speak to us they speak to us to and from our depths. I had an opportunity for about 7 years to be part of a monthly fairy tale enactment seminar with John Hill, who is a lovely Irish analyst who teaches in Zurich. And, you know, he loves the fairy tales. I think he lives in that liminal space. When you did supervision with him, you would tell him something and then he would just look off into space and hold that. And, you know, it was a little hard to get used to, like, did I say something wrong? But he was just so in touch with making space for that. So in these fairy tale seminars, we had so much fun that what we would do is we would take a fairy tale and we would each take a piece and we would try through psychodrama to enact it. And so the laughter and the tears and the coming to some kind of embodied sense of what the fairy tale was conveying was so rich. One of the other things I remember is he never could get the idea of Thai food. So we would, on the break, we would order Thai food and he loved it. But he'd always say, let's have some of that Thai food. It's like, he was about as good as I am at pronouncing. We'd go, no, John, it's Thai food, not Thai food. That's something completely different. Okay, I digress. Okay, since the original title of the tale identifies the king with the lion, our discussion of another tool of fairy tale analysis, mainly the people in the tale, we need to begin here. The original title tells us that although there are other characters in the drama, the king with the lion is paramount, at least originally, and we're deeply embedded in what's deeply embedded in the wisdom of this tale. So let us begin with the character that most captures our imagination. It's said by child psychologists and by children's writers that animals appeal to children. If you have a message you need to convey to children, having a rabbit or a bear or a frog deliver the message is infinitely more successful than having a person or least of all an adult. Again, just made a little note here of an aside. There's a Canadian woman who has a blog or a YouTube channel called Pluto Living. And by all means, check it out. She has a little talking dog, a little schnauzer. But what this schnauzer does is speak to some of the current events like isolation and COVID and whether or not to wear masks. And you watch this little thing and you recognize how much easier it is to hear that coming from this little animal than it would be coming from some politician or coming from some news anchor. So I encourage you to do that and you'll see what I mean. So in the beloved 100-acre woods of children's classic Winnie the Pooh, who better than a honey-loving bear to tell us how to quest after the sweetness of life? Or who better than a downtrodden donkey to show us the nature of inertia or pessimism, or a frenzied piglet to show us the nature of worry or anxiety? Maybe children like the animal messages because they are closer to the unconscious, and by they I mean both the children and the animals. Marie-Louise von Franz said that the archetypes are nature's constants. She was reiterating what Jung believed, that psyche and soma are two sides of the same coin. We are surely spirit and matter. In the poetic parlance of Desjardins, matter is spirit moving slowly enough to be seen. So in our lovely fairy tale, in the forms given of lion and king, the archetype of wholeness, both in the instinctual and the human, are featured. In fairy tales, the king or the lion are more often than not translated or interpreted to be symbols of the self. So, like Jung taught us to do with dreams, to unlock the full nature of the symbol, we must begin with amplification. We turn up the volume of meaning. And Jungians are really good at this, that we love that idea of amplifying the image. I remember the summer that I had volume 5 of Jung's collected work, and I carried it with me everywhere. Sitting in the park, sitting in the cafe, sitting at the back of the lecture hall. If I wasn't engaged in the lecture, I would be poring over Miss Miller's fantasies. And that's what Jung did in collected works, is that he never analyzed Miss Miller. He received her fantasies, and then what he did is he used her fantasies to amplify the images that she was expressing through those fantasies. So a few times, just when I was ready to toss the book into the lake for want of references to poor Miss Miller, he would return from the depth and the breadth of his amplifications to the woman. So he'd be off in these amplifications and then finally said, and now let us get back to Miss Miller. So the idea that sometimes the human, sometimes the objective can be lost in the amplification. So you have to kind of keep a foot in both worlds. So amplifications often mediate the subjective lens of the complex with the archetypal lens of the psyche. There's also, if you're interested, there's a Canadian writer by the name of Audrey Thomas, and she wrote an absolutely exquisite fiction called Blown Figures. And in this book, one of the characters is Miss Miller. So what she does is she uses fiction to explore what Jung did through these fantasies. And I'll tell you, it's almost what I would call a psychotic ride. Like, you read this book and you can feel almost it getting wonky because it's so effective in its display of the descent into madness. Okay, so Jung taught us that the symbol is the best representation of something still unknown. And that's the definition that I find the most accessible, that a symbol is the best representation of something still unknown. And Michael teaches us in the Assisi Institute that the objective nature of the symbol must be amplified. As he is often want to say, that if we dream of a lungfish, we best research what a lungfish is. And he tells wonderful stories about that from his own practice. I want to just add that about 7 years into my practice as an analyst, I was getting bored. And I'm thinking, how can I be bored when I have this incredible opportunity to be exploring the inscape with these people? Why am I bored? But so is boredom this call to go deeper? What is this? Is it analytical boredom? But it was becoming increasingly concerning. And that's when I found my way to the Assisi Institute and started to explore. So what is this about? And what I discovered is that I was drinking the Kool-Aid of contemporary Jungian psychology. I was analyzing the complex. I wasn't analyzing the depth of the unconscious. And that's why I was getting bored. I was allowing the subjective to eclipse the beauty of the depths. And so, I could do my amplifications, but if I wasn't connecting it back to the subjective and the objective, then that's why I was getting bored. So I'd learned it in Zurich, I'd learned it with fairy tales, but somehow over the years, I was kind of losing the thread. So amplifications of a symbol seek to bring together the limited level of consciousness and the limitless level of the collective unconscious. So to catch a symbol is to mark a point in the psyche that catches our attention. So when you're reading a fairy tale, have an ear for the symbols, because it's almost like if that were a spider web, that's the places where psychic energy is caught up in something and it wants your attention. So if you start piecing together those symbols, it's like putting together the pieces of a puzzle. That's one way to open up the aspects that the tale is trying to tell us. So if we explore the etymology of the word symbol, we learn that the symbolic joins where the diabolic divides. Through the disciplined amplification of the symbol, we have the opportunity to bring together the narrow lens of the subjective psyche with the broader lens of the objective psyche. Fairy tale analysis requires the same kind of discipline. In lion, we have a profound symbol and a significant dramatic personae. The lion is a solar animal. It's lion who opens up most bestiaries. A bestiary is a compendium of beasts. Originating in the ancient world, a bestiary was made popular in the Middle Ages in illustrated volumes that describe various animals and even rocks. You have to go back that far? Yes. As Leonard Cohen says, take me back to where the suffering began. So if you have a symbol, try to follow the breadcrumbs into the forest of time and see if it takes you to a gingerbread house or see if it takes you to a wicked witch. The natural history and the illustration of each beast was usually accompanied with a moral lesson. And you will find that in your study of fairy tales as well. The fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen, very much on the moral, very much on the Christian overlay. And there are other traditions that you see that it's not contaminated by that. So the more you study the tales, I think the more clear you can be with the message, despite the kind of moral overtones. So I encourage you to practice it as well, just by reading fairy tales. So as far back as the 2nd century Greek, the lion in both word and form is ranked superior. In one of the most popular and widely distributed documents of the medieval period, in the description of lion, we're told that lion cubs are born dead. And on the 3rd day, the lion breathes life into them. So as inspiration, as the spirit that animates dead matter, the lion is creator and king of the beasts. He's emblematic of the divine right of kings, at least in the animal kingdom. In fairy tales, he's often the symbol of the self, and the self being the capital S self, the archetype of wholeness. So let's go back to our tale. In our tale, we learn in the first paragraph that the king, in his human aspect, is dying. Our next person in the tale is the prince. Whatever this tale will illustrate of the psyche, as the titles suggest, it will speak of authority, reciprocity, and completion. The archetypal dimension of the tale will be demonstrated in part through the ruling principles of king and prince. The old ruling principle must yield to an emergent one. Can you see how, just like Dr. Conforti teaches us in his dream courses, and I was emphasizing last week, that if you slow down, these small details convey the deepest truths. So before we're any further than the first paragraph of this tale, because of the title, the threshold, and the first of the dramatic personae, we have a pretty good orientation toward the archetypal dimensions of the psyche that this tale is working over. And that's what this seminar is about, is to really be able to explore the archetypal dimensions of psyche. So the king, the old ruling principle of consciousness, is reaching its end. The prince, by succession, will represent a new ruling principle. Michael teaches us in his archetypal pattern analyst program that there's a self-organizing principle in the universe and in the psyche. He cites Eric Jantz, and The Self-Organizing Universe is one of the textbooks of the program. But what he says in that is that that a system will hearken back to its original state before making an evolutionary leap to increased complexity. So it goes forward and back, forward and back. It's like the rhythm of the heart, the systolic and the dystolic. So the king is dying and the prince is called back. He's called to return home. So he has to leave the field of the beloved. He has to leave the field of the potential conjunctio and go back to the old ruling principle. So he abandons his beloved and the field of the conjunctio with his bride, with a ring and a promise, and he returns to the king. So what he does in that is he shows the divided fidelity. So, I mean, think of that in terms of psyche. When you're trying to enter into a new field, the old field is so familiar, so you go back to it. And is your loyalty to what is emerging, or is your loyalty to what is familiar? And that's what we get in this motif of having to return to the dying king. Go back to the familiar, whether it's generative or not. It's striking how we repeat these patterns, even non-generative ones. Freud called this repetition compulsion. Repetition is a failed attempt at mastery. It's like we keep repeating it, hoping that we'll somehow get some traction, and maybe we will. But that return to the old is just so characteristic, and you see it in the fairy tales all the time. And you see it in the new sciences when they talk about the self-organizing universe. So I'm going to do a little bit with, well, not quite into the new sciences, more into the idea of evolutionary biology. See how much you're getting for your dollar here? You're getting psychology, you're getting new sciences, you're getting archetypal pattern analysis. Now I'm going to give you some zoology. Adolf Portman, he's a zoologist who has studied the ornamentation of birds. He's expressed that all living things have an innate desire to fully express themselves. An innate desire to fully express themselves. Jung called it individuation. Marie-Louise von Franz believed that all fairy tales tell the underlying story of individuation. That's what all fairy tales are about. But how is it done? There's not one path to the kingdom. There's not one path to the castle. So we need to explore all these ways in which throughout time, this is how we've done it. So let the profound truth of that sink in. Originality, ornamentation in the animal kingdom was thought to demonstrate Darwin's theory of evolution, the one most widely known, which is the theory of natural selection, the survival of the fittest. But our colleague Jennifer, she reminded us that there's a second theory, a less widely known theory of Darwin's. It's called the evolution of beauty. His almost forgotten theory of mate choice and how it shapes the animal world was returned to us by Richard Prum. So I'm grateful to Jennifer for that reminder. I mean, I certainly knew the theory of natural selection, and I referred to Darwin as that survival of the fittest. But what Prum does in his book is he talks about the evolution of beauty and the innate desire of a living organism to fully express itself. So the New York Times said, maybe this is a theory called the survival of the prettiest rather than the survival of the fittest. So, and it was the top 10 book of, I think, 2017. So check it out. It's called The Evolution of Beauty by Richard Prum, P-R-U-M. Okay. So our romantic poets, remember Keats? Ode to the Nightingale last week, he also wrote Ode to a Grecian Urn. And in Ode to a Grecian Urn, he says, truth and beauty, beauty, truth. That is all we know of earth and all we need to know. So why do I emphasize that? Because this isn't just about the survival of the mightiest. There's something here about the patterns of the heart and the unfolding of the heart. So in our fairy tale, there was almost immediate tension between the old order and the new order. The mate selection predicated on loyalty to established principles, and that predicated on fidelity to what is emergent. In this case, to matters of the heart. It echoes Romeo and Juliet. It echoes Fiddler on the Roof. It echoes West Side Story. Fairy tales and myths are stories that never happened but keep on happening. It should be no surprise that the old dying king elicits a deathbed promise from the prince. It's as if he's asking, to whom are you loyal? To your father complex? To this dominant ruling principle in the psyche? Or to the mystery, to the unknown bride? Either the and then we enter another archetypal fairy tale motif, false bride versus true bride. So we'll look at motifs and archetypal situations a bit later in the seminar series, I think in the third or the fourth one. But for now, the alignment of the emergent masculine or the ego to the feminine principle aligned to love, that's one side, versus the alignment of the emergent masculine ego to the feminine principle aligned to loyalty is made manifest. And that's the tension in this tale. So these initial conditions are developing a theme to be examined. So like good literature, the rising action, the development of the tale is drawing us in. I taught literature to high school students for 15 years. If you can hook them with the tension of development, with the tension of the rising action, then they might just show up for class, or if they show up, maybe they've even read the novel. So the tension between the false bride and the true bride is this recurrent story in fairy tales, literature, silver screen, romantic comedies, harlequin romances, and as such, it demonstrates an archetypal tension. You know, it's so hard to move from one field to the other. And so where does the loyalty lie? The loyalty sometimes lies in repetition, which would be the old bride, or in something that's emergent, which would be the true bride. So Marie-Louise von Franz taught us to look at the dramatic personae of fairy tales, and that present fairy tales that present the masculine and feminine divide. And again, not man and woman, more likely animus and anima. And we will look more fully at the structure of the psyche in the next seminar. So I'm purposely slowing this down, trying not to do too much at once, but by the end of this series, you will have the tools you need for archetypal fairy tale analysis. But we need to learn the rules of the road before you get behind the wheel. One of the other things that my training analyst, Dr. Baker, said when we graduated, it's like we get that package of tools that you get when you buy a new car. You know, they're in the trunk and you unfold them, and okay, I know what some of those things are, but some of those things I don't know until I need them. And then I'm glad I've got them. And he said that what happens over time is you start personalizing those tools, and you say, you know, if that one was just a little bit lighter, I could use it. Or if that one was just had my own handle on it, I could use it. And then eventually you get so adept at using these tools that they become like watchmaker tools. So that's my hope, that as you use these tools of fairy tale analysis, you'll get so good at just getting at the intricacy of the tale. And like Catherine Moreau said, that key will open and the beauty will fall out. So for now, it's enough to know that in every male, there's a contrasexual other that Jung named the anima. In every female, there is a contrasexual other that Jung named animus. So post and neo-Jungians have argued whether or not this theory is even valid, but this seminar is not going to address that discussion. We'll leave that for another time. For our purposes, I invite you to consider what this tale has to show us about the interplay between the animus and the anima in a human psyche. Is the masculine aligned to his father complex in his choice of anima, or to his heart and his individuating choice of anima? Is the feminine false or true? Is her animus father and duty bound, or is she loyal to the promises of her beloved's heart? And here's the dramatic shift in the tale. The true bride, the emergent feminine, the animus call to a new order as the ruling principle of the psyche, is for a time betrayed, forgotten, abandoned. The prince has let her fall out of his heart. The authority in the emergent masculine has forgotten the promises of his heart, and she almost dies of grief. And what would it mean if she dies? It would mean she goes back into the unconscious, and the complexity and the novelty that's yearning for consciousness, yearning to be manifest, it will fall back into the unconscious. But this is one feisty feminine, those of you who've read the tale. Or maybe she's an animus possessed feminine, and I'll leave that for you to argue. But she will not die. She will not retreat. She will fight for what has been promised to her. She will even fight if that requires a persona of deception. In this dramatic shift from the title that we're given, we're learning that the huntsmen of our tale are in fact maids. They're maids disguised as huntsmen. And so here's the trick, so why do they don the disguise? What does that say about how we win our way into the new field? So is she like Joan of Arc? And this disguise, is this deception in the service of life continuing? Or is the masculine principle abandoning the full expression of the feminine? In this tale, the 12 maids disguised as 12 huntsmen signify a proliferation of the dramatic personae. I don't think it's a fragmentation so much as it's a multiplicity of resolve, that there's a certain replicative pattern to kind of gain some energy, but you could disagree. So what the attempt is to win the emergent order back from that regressive pull to the loyalty of the old order. So Jung theorized that when a masculine and a woman showed up in numbers, this was the collective animus. The animus driven by the collective opinions rather than by personal experience. So you can watch for that. You can watch for that in fairy tales. Watch for how many there are in number, because that will tip you over as to whether or not this is an animus possession or whether or not this is a multiplicity. I had one analyst call it, we talk about the ani-mouse, and in a women's psyche, there's often the ani-mice. There's lots of them. So that in a man's psyche, what was that? The suggestion was that in a man's psyche, consciousness is polygamous and his unconscious is monogamous, and it's the opposite in a woman. I don't know whether that's true, but it has been said. Okay, this is where the Janus face of stories, the Janus face of dreams or fairy tales turn back on themselves. In the collective unconscious, yearning toward consciousness, the contradiction must resolve itself in paradox. So I've seen this trail translated or interpreted as a manifesto to the transgender because of the cross-dressing. I believe this is a mistake. I've also seen fairy tales written from a feminist perspective, a Freudian perspective, a Christian perspective. While these may be creative and have political and religious purposes, this is not my bent, nor is it the bent of the classical Jungians. And I hearken back to what Jane did, that she certainly was dealing with something contemporary and hot, and she was allowing the fairy tale to hold what she was expressing. When fairy tales or archetypal contents are enlisted to support an ideology or a political agenda, I believe it does damage both to the tale and to the unconscious issue that's seeking resolution. Concretizing or making literal the symbolic meaning of the tale is a pitfall of many a student of fairy tales. The subjective should never eclipse the objective. The personal should never eclipse the archetypal, but it does all the time. And that's why you need to employ an archetypal pattern analyst. I'm just kidding. I've got a full caseload. Okay. So I said last week that I almost failed my fairy tale exam in Zurich. This was a tale that I was given, and I worked the tale for 6 grueling hours to reach a conclusion. And so my interpretation of the tale was that it was expressing an emergence of feminine authority in the psyche that was not predicated on a masculine standpoint. I cited a definition of feminine authority that I had learned from Jungian analyst Josephine Evett-Secker. In a wonderful seminar on feminine authority, authorship, and authenticity, she defined feminine authority this way: the timely transgression of the rules in the service of life continuing. The timely transgression of the rules in the service of life continuing. I'll never forget that definition. And I love the concept that authority could reside in the feminine differently than it resides in the masculine. Unlike the more common definition of authority through the lens of the masculine, which defines authority as the power or the right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. This novel definition speaks of feminine authority as the transgressing of rules rather than the masculine authority of setting or enforcing. So clearly we need both accessible in our psyche. We need order, and we need to be attuned to when transgression serves life continuing. I can see more clearly how in my fairy tale analysis all those years ago, it's like I was bending the tale to my will. I was not letting the tale unfold its truth. In fact, I was triggered into a complex, and I was using the fairy tale to try to work through my complex. Remember that I warned that fairy tale does not prescribe how things should be or correct how things are. Fairy tales, like dreams or unconscious derivatives, they tell a story about how things are from this objective or archetypal perspective. You'll notice there's little emotion in a fairy tale. Gruesome things happen, but the characters don't respond. They don't react. They have no emotion. Princesses are locked in towers. Wolves swallow grandmothers. Soldiers wear bear skins, and witches eat children. So Dr. Conforti teaches his students to listen. He uses the phrase stereophonically, that with one ear, we have to listen to the voice of the complex. With the other ear, we have to listen to the archetypal dimension. So as Jung said in the Red Book, be prepared to confront the spirit of the depths and the spirit of the times. So if I were to grade my own exam today, I might suggest that the student had effectively analyzed the complex that was triggered in her by the tale she read. But I don't think I got into the depth of the archetypal dimension of the tale. So why is this important? And I think our next character tells us why. So an interesting aspect of the dramatis personae in fairy tales is that rarely are the characters named. Unlike in our myths where Medusa or Jason or Aphrodite are named, in fairy tales we have kings and queens and millers and witches, and I'm struggling with that word today, witches, there must be a complex at the edge, witches and princesses and stepmothers and trolls. Why? Because unlike myths, fairy tales are less likely to show us the ideals of the collective psyche and more likely to show us ourselves as we are aligned to these archetypal energies. Our kingliness or our trollness. If you recall, The King with the Lion was the original title of our tale. So this dramatis personae is the key to our analysis. Our prince, who is now king, has forsaken his beloved and betrothed to his father's choice for a bride. This loyalty to the old king is what blinds him to the deception that must be so obvious to the court, and at least it's very obvious to the lion. And maybe it's because of the lion that we're assured that all will not be lost. You know, when you're an analyst and you're listening to a dream and you can just see where this pattern is going, and you just hope there's going to be some hint of something redemptive that you can hook onto. So in this tale, I think what's potentially redemptive is that the lion's not tricked by the deception of the anima. Although our new king is yoked to a deathbed promise, and by such to the regressive old order, he has also made a promise to the marriage bed. The magic lion will act almost like a homeopathic remedy, or almost like a vaccine. The true bride has infiltrated the field, and lion knows. In fact, the lion, as the king's confidant, is his instinctual truth teller. He will amplify what is true that appears false, and what is false that appears true. And that's what's so wonderful about fairy tales. This once upon a time is a place where magic still resides. I think what is described as the magical element in fairy tales that Wolfgang Pauli, von Franz, or Jung later described as synchronicities, and Michael would describe as field phenomenon. Archetypes are not bound by space and time. And when they are not given form, when they are not contained, their energy can be experienced as magic, both as black magic or white magic. Now, Marie-Louise von Franz would disagree with that statement. She says magic is magic. It's the ego that divides it into black magic or white magic. So I'll take that correction. You can just hear her in my ear. So as the tension in the tale rises, are we rooting for the lion and his truth, or are we rooting for the true bride and her deceptions? As anyone who's been gripped by a complex, anyone? Or an archetypal content breaking into consciousness, you know the tension in the collective psyche building in our tale is all too familiar. The old king has died. The true bride has been forsaken. The prince has become king and is prepared to sacrifice the future to his blind loyalty to the past. Thankfully, a truth-telling lion and the new order of the feminine has crossed the threshold and infiltrated the field. Transformation is imminent. We lean towards this complex and we lean toward this climax and this lysis. Even though the maids can learn to dress, walk, and focus like men, if you remember the tale, the lion says, let's set the trick and lay out the peas, because any woman would tiptoe through the peas, and they get word that that's the trap, and so they walk like men and they just crush the peas as they walk. Any woman would be distracted by a beautiful spinning wheel. No, stay singular of focus and don't let the spinning wheel draw your attention. Now, we could say this is, this feminist would have a riot with this, but remember, it's archetypal. What it's saying is that the feminine has to develop in her capacity to discern, to stay focused in order to win the bride. She's undifferentiated. There's 12 of her. She has to develop the capacity for discernment. It's very much like the story of Psyche and Eros and the tasks of Psyche. Okay, and although the king continues to ignore and doubt his instincts, truth wins out. But it wins out in the forest. It wins out in the unconscious, and that's often where the first field emerges. So that word comes that the false bride is approaching, and that the future will be yoked to the past. And then at that moment, the new order of the feminine, the true bride, she falls unconscious. And when she's unconscious, the deception falls away. The unconscious lapse in the disguise, but true bride is what wakes up the king. As the disguise of the hunter falls from his favorite huntsman, when he sees the ring of his heart's promise, self-deception falls from his own eyes. He comes back to his original heart's promise. He remembers his beloved. As for the lysis of our tale, the future is secure and mate selection according to heart replaces mate selection according to economic or political advantage. We could say it's the tension between eros and logos. And perhaps best of all, the lion is restored to his place as truth teller. So there's so much more we could do with this tale, and I'm going to finish in 1 minute. We have rich symbols that we've not unpacked. There's the ring, the court, the peas, the spinning wheels, the servants, the glove, the false bride, the forest, but by no means is this a comprehensive analysis of the 12 huntsmen. But I do hope it's giving you the tools to ponder further. It's my hope that it has given you some more questions than answers. Is this a story of the anima? Is this a story of the animus? Is the king emblematic of authority in the feminine? Is the true bride emblematic of authority in the masculine? What is the nature of the hunt? What is the right relationship between human and animal? What does reciprocity between mind and instinct serve? What is truth? What is deception? And why is this tale so timeless? So next week, we're going to dive into the structures of the psyche as revealed in fairy tales. Based on Murray Stein's Jungian map of the soul, we're going to move on to a new fairy tale to demonstrate both what we have already practiced in our analysis and what new tools want to be uncovered. So those of you who want to get a heads up, we're probably going to do the glass mountain. So that will be the next tale that we look at as we look at structures of the psyche. All right, 101, not bad. And the internet connection held. So thank you again, Sylvia, for agreeing to be my understudy if necessary. And I hope you found that helpful. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Muriel. See y'all next week.